The Tao Te Ching is attributed to the 6th century BC Chinese sage Lao Tzu. Some scholars dispute this fact and say it was composed at a later date and that Lao Tzu was not its author. There is so little written of Lao Tzu that some even believe he may have been a legendary figure, although there is a strong tradition in Confucianism that he did live. Lao Tzu is believed to have been an older contemporary of Confucius. The doctrine of the Tao set forth in the Tao Te Ching probably did not originate with Lao Tzu. As I said in my introductory lecture on the goal of Taoist immortality, one Chinese legend says this teaching was handed down from the Yellow Emperor, who lived in the 3rd millennium BC, until Lao Tzu wrote it down. The Yellow Emperor is said to have reigned from 2696 to 2598 BC. That is the era of his reign, almost a century. Despite these arguments, the Tao Te Ching has become one of the most cherished scriptures of the world. Its sayings are enigmatic and mystical. The Tao Te Ching means classic of the way and of virtue, or the book of the way and its power. The text of the Tao Te Ching is divided into 2 halves. One is called the Tao, spelled T-A-O, meaning way. The other is called the De, spelled T-E, and usually it is translated as virtue. Jing, spelled C-H-I-N-G, is the Chinese term meaning classic or scripture. This title is given to books that are highly venerated. For this Summit University course, we are using Robert G. Henrich's translation of the Tao Te Ching. You might say that the word means the way of virtue scripture. In my commentary, I will be supplementing his work with several other translations. Henrich's translation is based on ancient manuscripts discovered in 1973 in the village of Mawangdui in south-central China. These manuscripts contain 2 copies of the Tao Te Ching. They are a significant find because they are more than 5 centuries older than any other known copies of the Tao Te Ching. They are therefore considered to be more authoritative and closer to the original version of this scripture. Like other versions of the Tao Te Ching, the Mawangdui texts are divided into 2 parts. But in these manuscripts, the order of the 2 parts is switched. The section on virtue comes first, instead of the section on the way. Consequently, I will begin my teaching with the first chapter from the virtue section, which in other manuscripts is labeled Chapter 38. To avoid confusion when comparing different translations, Henrichs still calls this first chapter, Chapter 38. Before we begin the teachings of Lao Tzu on virtue, we need to understand the term de, or virtue, against the backdrop of the term Tao. First of all, let us review the meaning of Tao. Jean Campbell Cooper writes, "For Lao Tzu, Tao was no limited way or method, but the transcendental first cause, the primordial unity, the ineffable, the timeless, all-pervading principle of the universe, giving rise to the universe, yet undiminished by it, supporting and controlling it. The Tao is that which preceded the creation of heaven and earth. It is called the Absolute, the ultimate reality, the nameless, the portal of all mystery, the cosmic order. Some liken it to the Atman of Hinduism, the suchness of Buddhism, the Ein Sof of Kabbalism, or the monad of the Greeks, that which has neither qualities nor attributes. The goal of returning to the Tao is a strong theme in the Tao Te Ching. Max Kaltenmark describes this teaching in his book, Lao Tzu and Taoism. He says, all life is governed by the same permanent law, the return to the origin. To know this law is to possess a superior intelligence that Lao Tzu calls light. But the holy man is not content with merely knowing this law intellectually. He realizes it within himself by returning to the Tao in person. The import of this returning is spiritual. It is a matter of identifying oneself with the Tao through an inward realization of its unity and simplicity. Originally, the Tao Te Ching seems to have been written as a handbook for the ruler or sage king on how to rule by the power of the Tao. Later Taoist writers, like Zhuangzi, produced texts geared more to the private path of the individual. Ellen M. Chen writes in the introduction to her translation of the Tao Te Ching, from the Western religious perspective, the Tao Te Ching does not appear to be a religious text. With most of its chapters concerning how to be a sage ruler, it seems more a political treatise than a religious tract. Yet it must be treated as a religious tract. Rather than distinguishing between the kingdom of heaven and the human kingdom, the Tao Te Ching distinguishes between the way Tao governs and the way humans govern, both of which are in this world. It proposes that human government attune itself with the government of Tao. Indeed, it proposes that human government fade away, so that the government of Tao pervades over all. What does the word de mean as it is used in the Tao Te Ching? De has been translated many different ways, including virtue, power, action, life, inner potency, integrity, and character. It is not what we would normally think of today as virtue in the sense of innate goodness or morality. The meaning of the word de is more along the lines of what virtus, the Latin root word for virtue, means. Virtus in Latin means manliness, strength, capacity, or worth. Arthur Waley notes that virtus originally meant the inherent power in a person or thing. The inherent power in a person or thing. To me, it is the seed atom of individual being. It may be the seed or patterned power of everything that exists in the universe, what the Chinese call the 10,000 things. As Holmes Welch explains, Tao is the underlying unity. De is its power, and the power of the man who follows it. I say the power of the way lies in the virtue, purity of its application. Han Fei, the first commentator of Lao Tzu, who wrote in the 3rd century BC, said, De is the meritorious work of the Tao. De is the meritorious work of the Tao. The Taoist sage Zhuangzi, who is considered the co-founder with Lao Tzu of Taoism, said, unless there be the attainment of De, the perfect Tao cannot be realized. When De is achieved, one is said to have returned to one's original nature. I see De as the inner Christ, which is the image and likeness of God in which we were made. It is the seed potential of the real self. True virtue is embodied in this image and likeness of God. and you and I are made in that image and likeness. De, as the inner Christ and the real self, exists within us as a potential to be realized. It is realized in the course of our daily lives as we bring forth the fruits of action, the De of the Tao. Through embodying the De in this life, we attain to the level of the image and likeness of God. And at the conclusion of this life, our souls merge with the inner Christ, or the real self. Jean Campbell Cooper elaborates on the Taoist concept of De. She writes, De is, in a sense, Tao made manifest, the revelation of the true nature of the Tao, which I would say is the true nature of the sons and daughters of God. Although occasionally employed to signify conventional virtue, the true meaning is the quality of natural goodness, which is the result of enlightenment and of the manifestation and function of the Tao in man and in all that exists in the universe. It is an inward quality in man and all creatures, a potentiality and latent natural power arising from and dependent on the Tao, from which it is an emanation. End of quote by Cooper. I say that there is no natural goodness in the natural man, the human. The man that we know following the exit from Eden and his descent from the Golden Age consciousness embodied by the Yellow Emperor. The only inherent goodness that man can have is God, the indwelling spirit or the inner Tao. Enlightenment, a definite experience on the path of life, illumines the Tao, revealing the spiritual nature of our being. By free will, then, the soul incorporates the goodness of the Tao. If we speak of morality in the human sense of right and wrong, the Tao has none, because this sense is relative, and the Tao is absolute in wholeness and pure being. The De of the Tao, or the virtue of the way, simply is. It is the light manifestation of, or the light action of, the I am that I am. This virtue is a state of being and a state of embodying the body of the law, the causal body, or in Buddhist terms, the Dharmakaya. In the Tao, the law and the lawgiver are one. I see the Tao as the universal body of first cause, whose nucleus is the divine monad. This divine monad we call the I am that I am, or the I am presence. Together, the causal body and the divine monad make up the yin and the yang of being, the Tao. Cooper continues. Zhuang-Tzu defines De as the perfect attainment of harmony. I define this as centripetal, yang, inward, and centrifugal, yin, outward, being in equilibrium. The perfect attainment of harmony, being in equilibrium. What in theistic religions is an obligation to conform to the will of God is, in Taoism, a natural cooperation with the harmony of the universe, says Cooper. The fundamental law and order of the Tao governs the whole cosmos, and to this law and order man must conform if he is to fulfill his potential and play his part in maintaining the cosmic harmony. The animal and plant worlds conform naturally by instinct. Only man chooses to maintain or destroy the balance. I say that man destroys the balance by entering into a relative and limited awareness of the yang and yin forces of life. It is his sense of duality that allows him to see yang and yin as separate, and each one as relative and imperfect. In the enlightened state, man sees the yin as the other side of the yang, and the yang as the other side of the yin, and the two comprising the equilibrium of the plus and minus of these cosmic forces. I say that the great Tao is the yang of non-being. The great Tao contains within itself the great De. And the great De is the yin of being. This yin is the yin of potentiality, self-realized in virtue, integrity, and honor. I will revisit the concept of non-being and being according to Taoism when I give you my lecture on Chapter 40. The yin is the active side of the yang, without which the yang cannot be or activate anything in the world. The yang is the passive side of the yin, without which the yin cannot have being or fulfill its reason for being. When dealing with an enigmatic text, sometimes the explanations are also enigmatic. I think if you meditate on what I have said, you will understand profoundly the meaning of this passage. Cooper continues, "Ignorance is at the root of man's moral malaise. It is his lack of knowledge and understanding of his true nature and its identity with the Tao. Ignorance identifies him with the impressions of the senses. He imagines them to be the sum total of experience and knowledge, confusing the body with the power which works in and through it, and setting up a chain of false values. I say that in this state of ignorance, man knows only the false yang and the false yin, the inverted Tao and the inverted De. He knows not the mystery of non-being and being in the absolute sense of the word. Tao is the masculine and De is the feminine. Each is whole in itself, yet playing in the great cosmic play as two halves of the divine one." Cooper goes on to explain that in Taoist thought, to do right is to obey the laws of nature, of virtue, and to live in conformity and harmony with them. Failure to do so brings automatic and equally natural retribution, disharmony, disruption, and consequent misery. Thus, Taoism cannot be without the law of cause and effect, the law of karma, positive and negative. Heaven is just as bound by these ordinances as is man, in view of the mutual interdependence of all things. In his translation of the Tao Te Ching, Whaley renders the word De as power. He says that virtue is not a good English equivalent for De, because if we study the usage of the word carefully, we find that De can be bad as well as good. What is a bad virtue, he asks. He implies that there is no such thing. So he says, on examining the history of the word De, we find that it means something much more like the Indian karma, save that the fruits of De are generally manifested here and now, whereas karma is bound up with a theory of reincarnation, and its effects are usually not seen in this life, but in a subsequent incarnation. De, then, is anything that happens to one, or that one does, indicating that as a consequence, one is going to meet with good or bad luck, or as we would say, good or bad karma. It means, so to speak, the stock of credit or the deficit that at any given moment a man has at the bank of fortune. We would call this bank the cosmic bank or the causal body. The early Chinese also regarded the planting of seeds as a de. De is bound up with the idea of potentiality. Fields planted with corn represent potential riches. The appearance of a rainbow, potential disaster. The falling of sweet dew, potential peace and prosperity. Hence, de means a latent power, a quote, virtue, unquote, inherent in something. Only when the moralistic position was thoroughly established, that is to say, after the doctrines of Confucianism had become a state orthodoxy, did de come to mean what we usually mean by virtue, that is to say, conduct beautiful and admirable in itself, apart from its consequences. Victor Mayer, another translator of the Ma Wang-dui manuscripts, says he translates de as integrity, because in simplest terms, integrity means no more than the wholeness or completeness of a given entity. Like de, it represents the selfhood of every being in the universe. I like the word integrity because it always gives to me the sense of my integration with first cause. And on that is my integrity based. Mayer says, as it is used in the Tao Te Ching, de signifies the personal qualities or strengths of the individual, one's personhood. De is determined by the sum total of one's actions, good and bad. Therefore, it is possible to speak of cultivating one's de, just as you would cultivate enlightenment, cultivate the Christ consciousness, cultivate Buddhic awareness. Like karma, de is the moral weight of a person, the moral weight, which may be either positive or negative. In short, de is what you are. De represents self-nature or self-realization, only in relation to the cosmos. It is in fact the actualization of the cosmic principle of self. De is the embodiment of the way and is the character of all entities in the universe. Each creature, each object has a de, which is its own manifestation of the Tao, its own unique seed potential. The relationship between individual de and cosmic Tao is almost exactly parallel to the relationship between the Indian concept of Atman, soul, and Brahman, the all-pervading divine reality of the universe. Jivatman, the living soul, is the self, whereas Paramatman, the utmost soul, is none other than Brahman. Thus the quintessential Hindu formula, Tat Tvam Asi, which is translated, that thou art, or thou art that. Tat Tvam Asi. In other words, you are one with the universe. Tao and Brahman both represent cosmic unity, while de and Atman stand for the individual personality or character. Just as the Bhagavad Gita portrays the absorption of the separate soul, Atman, into the cosmic unity, Brahman, so the Tao Te Ching describes the assimilation of the individual personality, de, in the eternal way, Tao. End of quote by Whaley. Before I start reading and commenting on each chapter and on each line of each chapter, let me tell you what we're up against. In chapter 70 of the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu gives us this advice. My words are easy to understand and easy to put into practice. Yet no one in the world can understand them. I believe this is true to the extent that the mortal mind cannot contain, cannot comprehend, cannot put its arms around the immortal mind. The soul does not attain full comprehension of the Tao until it merges with it. Until then, the soul can only approximate the supreme reality of first cause. I shall read Robert Henrich's translation of the Tao Te Ching, chapter 38, which elucidates the meaning of de, virtue. First, I'm going to give you the chapter in its entirety without comment. Then I will give you the commentary of experts and my own. Chapter 38 of the De Tao Ching, translated by Robert Henrichs. The highest virtue is not virtuous, therefore it truly has virtue. The lowest virtue never loses sight of its virtue, therefore it has no true virtue. The highest virtue takes no action, yet it has no reason for acting this way. Other translations say has no motive for acting this way. The highest humanity takes action, yet it has no reason or motive for acting this way. The highest righteousness takes action, and it has its reasons for acting this way. The highest propriety takes action, and when no one responds to it, then it angrily rolls up its sleeves and forces people to comply. Therefore, when the way is lost, only then do we have virtue. When virtue is lost, only then do we have humanity. When humanity is lost, only then do we have righteousness. And when righteousness is lost, only then do we have propriety. As for propriety, it is but the thin edge of loyalty and sincerity and the beginning of disorder. And the foreknowledge is but the flower of the way and the beginning of stupidity. Therefore the great man dwells in the thick and doesn't dwell in the thin, dwells in the fruit and doesn't dwell in the flower. Therefore he rejects that and takes this. That is the complete chapter 38. Victor Mayer's translation of chapter 38 from the same manuscript is, the person of superior integrity does not insist upon his integrity. For this reason he has integrity. The person of inferior integrity never loses sight of his integrity. For this reason he lacks integrity. The person of superior integrity takes no action, nor has he a purpose for acting. The person of superior humaneness takes action, but has no purpose for acting. The person of superior righteousness takes action and has a purpose for acting. The person of superior etiquette takes action, but others do not respond to him, whereupon he rolls up his sleeves and coerces them. Therefore, when the way is lost, afterward comes integrity. When integrity is lost, afterward comes humaneness. When humaneness is lost, afterward comes righteousness. When righteousness is lost, afterward comes etiquette. Now, etiquette is the attenuation of trustworthiness and the source of disorder. Foreknowledge is but the blossomy ornament of the way and the source of ignorance. For this reason, the great man resides in substance, not in attenuation. He resides in fruitful reality, not in blossomy ornament. Therefore he rejects the one and adopts the other. He takes the yang fruit and leaves the yin flower. I will now read to you lines from chapter 38 on which I will give comment. Line 1. The highest or superior virtue, or the person of highest virtue, is not virtuous. Therefore it or he truly has virtue. Max Calton Mark's commentary on this passage is, superior virtue, or highest virtue, is hard to distinguish from the Tao, whose efficacious virtue it is. So the holy man has no virtue other than superior de. He has no virtue, hence merit, particular to himself. Of this I would say, he can truly say, I and the Tao are one. I and the De are one. Of mine own self, I can do nothing. It is the Tao in me that is the De, and that performeth the work of the De. Anna Seidel writes, the superior virtue of Taoism is a latent power that never lays claim to its achievements. It is the mysterious power of Tao, present in the heart of the sage. And this mysterious power in the heart of the saint sage is revealed by the ascended master Saint Germain to be the eternal flame, the divine spark, that itself is the seed of light from the Tao. Saint Germain says, your heart is one of the choicest gifts of God. Within it there is a central chamber, surrounded by such light and protection that we call it a cosmic interval. I submit to you that the meaning of the term cosmic interval is the point of equilibrium of yin and yang. The point where a planet in the heavens turns about and goes retrograde. There is a moment of stillness, of equilibrium, of highest power and significance. And so there is such light and protection in balance in your heart that this chamber is called a cosmic interval. It is a chamber separated from matter, and no probing could ever discover it. Why? Because the point of equilibrium is not a manifestation in matter. It is that point where matter has become spirit. It occupies simultaneously not only the third and fourth dimensions, but also other dimensions unknown to man. It is thus the connecting point of the mighty silver cord of light that descends from your divine God presence to sustain the beating of your physical heart, giving you life, purpose, and cosmic integration. I urge all men to treasure this point of contact that they have with life by paying conscious recognition to it. You do not need to understand by sophisticated language or scientific postulation the how, why, and wherefore of this activity. Be content to know that God is there and that there is within you a point of contact with the divine, a spark of fire from the Creator's own heart, which is called the threefold flame of life. There it burns as the triune essence of love, wisdom, and power. Each acknowledgement paid daily to the flame within your heart will amplify the power and illumination of love within your being. Each such attention will produce a new sense of dimension for you, if not outwardly apparent, then subconsciously manifest within the folds of your inner thoughts. Neglect not then your heart as the altar of God. Neglect it not as the sun of your manifest being. Draw from God the power of love and amplify it within your heart. We could be saying, draw from the great Tao the power of love and amplify it by the De in your heart. Then send it out into the world at large as the bulwark of that which shall overcome the darkness of the planet, saying, I am the light of the heart, shining in the darkness of being, and changing all into the golden treasury of the mind of Christ. I am projecting my love out into the world to erase all errors and to break down all barriers. I am. The Tao in me is the power of infinite love, amplifying itself by the power of the De, until it is victorious, world without end. Chapter 38, line 2, reads, The person of low or inferior virtue never loses sight of his virtue. Therefore he has no true virtue. Carlton Marx says this means the man of inferior virtue takes pride in those Confucian virtues that the vulgar people take for goodness. Lin Yutang translates the opening of chapter 38 as, The man of superior character is not conscious of his character, hence he has character. The man of inferior character is intent on not losing character, hence he is devoid of character. Lin Yutang says, Taoism lays great emphasis on unconscious goodness, goodness that is natural and without motivation. The moment goodness is motivated, it is regarded as a decline or deviation from Tao. Chen's comment on this passage is, consciousness leads to loss. To become conscious of something is to lose hold of that very thing one has become conscious of. When nature is perfect, as in high virtue, it is unconscious of itself. As soon as nature becomes conscious, it falls below itself, which is low virtue. High virtue, unconscious of itself, transcends itself to become one with Tao. In the Tao Te Ching, low virtue means the loss of nature's original perfection. The loss of nature's original perfection. Chapter 38, line 3. The highest virtue takes no action, yet it has no reason for acting this way. The virtue that takes no action, in my mind, is the Tao in motion, in perpetual motion. It is not a conscious taking of action. It simply is. Chen explains, a person of high virtue at one with Tao and the movement of all beings does not act or toil. There is no cause of action. A person of low virtue, standing apart to judge the world, relying on the self, and doing everything consciously, is burdened with toil. End of quote from Chen. Chapter 38, lines 4 to 6. The highest humanity, or the highest human kindness or human-heartedness, takes action, yet it has no reason for acting this way. The highest righteousness takes action, and it has reasons for acting this way. The highest propriety or ritual behavior takes action, and when no one responds to it, then it angrily rolls up its sleeves and forces people to comply. Chen translates this last phrase, A person of high propriety acts, yet finding no response, proceeds to bare the arms and throw a rope. Chen says this is a criticism of the propriety or social behavior that divides people into different social roles as a supposed means of maintaining social order. She says Lao Tzu's position is, true piety does not distinguish or divide. Distinguishing and dividing gives cause to quarrels and wars. When I observe all the rules of propriety, I demand that others do likewise. When they fail, I feel justified in making claims and waging war. To bare one's arms and to throw a rope are acts showing determination prior to engaging in combat. Chen continues, in the writing of Zhuang Tzu, there is an excellent commentary on chapter 38 of the Tao Te Ching. It reads, in a time of perfect de or virtue, the gait of men is slow and ambling. Their gaze is steady and mild. In such an age, mountains have no paths or trails, lakes no boats or bridges. The 10,000 things live species by species, one group settled close to another. Birds and beasts form their flocks and herds. Grass and trees grow to fullest height. So it happens that you can tie a cord to the birds and beasts and lead them about, or bend down the limb and peer into the nest of the crow and the magpie. Then along comes the sage, huffing and puffing after humanity or human-heartedness, reaching on tiptoe for righteousness, and the world for the first time has doubts, mooning and mouthing over his music, snipping and stitching away at his rights, and the world for the first time is divided. If Tao and De had not been cast aside, how would there be any call for human-heartedness and righteousness? If the true form of the inborn nature had not been abandoned, how would there be any use for rites and music? Chen says, people in this state of nature are virtuous because they do not know what virtue is. Moral virtues are called forth due to the loss of nature. The important thing is to preserve the original wholeness. Then all will be well. Cooper explains this concept further. She writes, Zhuang Tzu says that there is nothing more fatal than intentional, that is, structured virtue, when the mind looks outward. When the mind looks outward. It is sometimes suggested that the moral and ethical is ignored or neglected in Taoism. But this is a misunderstanding. There is no emphasis on morality because it is taken for granted. The stage of ethics is already surpassed. I say it is taken for granted because it is internalized. The perfect achievement of this is when the soul achieves bonding to the inner Tao, the I am that I am. Then the doer and the deed are one. Therefore, the doer cannot be self-conscious of doing the deed. He is both doer and deed in action. Virtue translates as the integration of the soul, the heart and the mind with the Tao. Virtue, integrity, potentiality, power simply is. And the saint sage can only say, I am that I am. As the sun is not separated from the sunshine, so the soul is not separated from the source. The Atman is one with Brahman, and the individual is become the active, inactive Tao in equilibrium. Cooper continues, the sage, the living example of the De, is not a, quote, moral man, since morals do not enter into his mind. I say he is neither moral nor amoral. He simply is the yin and yang, of morality and amorality in equilibrium. Hence, the doer and the deed being one, His self-awareness is that of wholeness, neither this nor that, but beingness that is the vessel for the Supreme Being, the great Tao. In him, the spontaneity of the Tao is observed moment by moment. Through such a one, the Tao can be seen in the fullness of its expressionless expression. Cooper says, the sage is already so perfectly adjusted and in such complete harmony with his surroundings that he acts with spontaneous perfection, far beyond any rules of thou shalt not. He is beyond any concepts of good and evil. Zhuangzi says, the sage has no deficiency in his character and therefore needs no morality. Conscious virtue appears only in an already fallen society and is symptomatic of spiritual malaise. Note that the difference here is a difference between conscious and unconscious virtue. The unconscious virtue is true virtue. When one has to become conscious of it, it is no longer oneself. Perfect simplicity and naturalness belong to the primordial and paradisal state of the Tao. The fall from the perfect state of the Tao into human virtues and vices is illustrated in lines 7 through 10 of chapter 38. When the way or Tao is lost, only then do we have virtue. When virtue is lost, only then do we have humanity or human kindness. When humanity is lost, only then do we have righteousness. And when righteousness is lost, only then do we have propriety. This passage is taken to be an attack on the human virtues advocated by Confucianists. Carlton Marx says, human-heartedness and righteousness are the supreme virtues of Confucianism. Lao Tzu's view is that active beneficence, righteousness, respect for convention, law, and duty, intelligence, where the moral and ritual laws are concerned, filial piety, including the duties inherent in ancestor worship, loyalty to the ruler, all these attitudes and notions would be pointless if men knew how to make their behavior conform to the natural order. That is, if the soul knew how to achieve union with the inner Christ, the real self, the smaller wafer with the greater wafer, the non-permanent with the permanent. Carlton Marx says, every step away from the Tao leads them further and further down the slope toward moral and political anarchy. Consider the controversy in 1990 when the Cincinnati Contemporary Art Center and its director were put on trial on obscenity charges for exhibiting the photographs of Robert Mapplethorpe, which included pictures of sadomasochistic acts and children with their genitals exposed. The sexually explicit exhibit caused a storm in Cincinnati, a conservative city that is the headquarters for the National Coalition Against Pornography. People were polarized by the issue. Citizens formed several organizations in favor of the show in response to protests from the conservative groups. When the jury found the museum and its director not guilty, the anti-obscenity lobby called it a serious setback, and those in favor of the exhibit called it a victory for First Amendment rights and artistic creativity. When people become conscious of relative standards of decency and non-decency, they do not know where to draw the line. So they fight with each other over who and what is right or wrong. This is the heart of Lao Tzu's message and the message he directs to Confucius himself. What I am saying today is that the great De, embodied by the inner Christ, the real self, is not subject to relative right and wrong, nor is the great Tao embodied by the I Am Presence. Only the soul's synthesis of the yin and the yang, of the great Tao and the great Der, can establish the heart in the plumb line of truth, which is neither righteous nor unrighteous. By slipping into the shining sea of the great Tao, the dewdrop of self gains self-awareness through the completeness of the great Tao. Not this, not that, but equilibrium. Not positive or negative, but the dot in the center of the circle, where time and space, plus and minus, are not, but only perpetual reality in the perpetual state of becoming and of unbecoming. Today, the Ascended Masters teach us the how-to of Taoism, and they illustrate the steps of the soul's self-transcendence through the chart of your divine self. It is the chart of the Tao, the Der, and the lower self whose goal it is to attain bonding to both. The chart that you see before you shows three figures, the upper, the middle, and the lower figure. I see the upper figure as the great Tao, the central figure as the great Der, and the lower figure, the lower self that is seeking to attain union with both. Our understanding of the great Tao is truly the first cause, Brahman, the universal being of God. As earlier we said, it is the fecund womb of the Great Mother, containing all of cosmos within itself. The great causal body is individualized for each one of us. Lao Tzu taught this. Each one of us has that Tao. And so in this chart, we see that Tao individualized as the divine self, which is above the lower self in vibration and in consciousness. When the consciousness of the lower self begins to equate with that of the higher self, then the two become one, because things equal to the same thing are equal to each other. We see then that the activating force of the Der in the central figure is the point of the nexus through the activation and the action of Der that is unconscious, perhaps at first conscious and then becoming unconscious. That lower self begins to put on the levels of a higher way and a higher consciousness. The Christians talk about three in one, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. These are also illustrated on this chart. The upper figure represents not only the Father, but the Father-Mother. It is the great sphere of first cause, or the causal body. The terms Father-Mother in Taoism are translated as Yang and Yin. In Taoism, in place of the concentric spheres of light that make up that body, you would see the symbol of the great Tai Chi, otherwise known as the serpent swallowing its tail. That great sphere of wholeness is the source from whence we descended. And the descent means the lowering of vibration, where we have lost the consciousness of this completeness and this wholeness, and therefore we are obliged to abide by rules of right and wrong, this and that, what is moral and what is not moral. And these are relative states of consciousness. The central figure is the great mediator, and this is the meaning of the Der. This potentiality of being, this seed potential that is a perfect pattern. That central figure reflects the image and the likeness of God to the lower figure. The lower figure being in the relative state as we are today, conscious of sin and not sin, is not able to perceive the absolute. And so the De has been sent forth. In Christian terms, the De would be the only begotten Son, not in the sense of a human being, but in the sense of the universal Christ. And that universal being, that mediator, is a step down or a going forth of an emanation of light from the great Tao above.